I'm reading this great memoir by my guest, Henry Shukman. It's called One Blade of Grass. And in it, there's this incredible story, which you're going to hear Henry tell today. But it's about this guy named Speedy. And in Henry's words, Speedy didn't have a house, but he was at home everywhere, in the fields, in the hedgerows, in broken down barns. He knew how to live with almost nothing. And he had this exceptional kind of freedom, the kind I hadn't even known was possible. That's one of the stories that you're going to hear today from my guest, Henry Shukman, a Zen teacher and a poet who has spent his life exploring what it means to live well. Greetings, I'm Carl, and this is another episode of 50 Fires, a podcast about money and purpose. Today, as I mentioned, you're going to meet my guest, Henry Shukman, a Zen teacher, a poet, a lecturer at Oxford and Harvard Business School, and the author of the beautiful memoir, One Blade of Grass. Henry is also the co-creator of the new meditation app called The Way. And while he spent decades in deep spiritual practice, what really struck me about our conversation today wasn't the philosophy, it was the practicality. We talked about what to do when you get hit with a surprise tax bill, how to stop catastrophizing when the markets get scary, how to find calm in your body before your brain runs wild, and importantly, how to live more generously, not because you should, but because it feels better. This isn't actually a conversation about money management. It's a conversation about money freedom. So let's get into it with my guest, Henry Shukman. Thanks for the book, by the way. Like One Blade of Grass has been really amazing.
Oh, so happy to hear it. That's
Yeah. So, Henry, where I would love to start is at the beginning. And I'm just curious about how you would reflect on your earliest memory of money.
I had a little red piggy bank. I don't know if that's a British term or an American term.
No, yeah, we share it. Yep.
A little kind of plastic safe box with a dial on it, and it had a little code. I can't remember what it was or how exactly it worked, but you had to turn it 2 or 3 times or something. Pop, the door would open, and I would really enjoy kind of keeping my pennies and threepenny bits. That's a threepenny bit they had in England back then, and my halfpennies. That's a halfpenny bit, right. And my sixpence bits. The pennies back then were quite big. They were bigger than a quarter. A US quarter. They were bigger than that. They were. I guess they were. What are they? Copper or bronze or whatever. I don't know. They were not silver colored, but copper colored, and really quite big. And it was kind of fun to see that you could see the dates on them. And if you had an old one, it would be a different monarch, on the back side of it. And it was kind of exciting to see my little collection grow. So that was one side of it. And then we'd go to there was a thing that lots of kids had in England called a post office savings account. The post office had a system where you could put money in your savings account, and you'd have a little tiny kind of exercise book thing that would show how much money you had in it, how much you just dropped into it. And I remember, going down with my dad or with my mum to the post office about half a mile away, walking there, making deposits, pulling money out, and it was just sort of exciting to be storing it and to be able to withdraw it at times.
You've used that word exciting twice. Tell me about that. I mean, like just the sense or the feeling of exciting back then.
Yeah, I think it was the fact that it was sort of that thing called money was so outside of the real kind of fabric of my life as I knew it. Suddenly,
Mm.
there's this whole other thing, that everybody kind of know, all the adults know about, and it's part of their world, and I can get a little piece of it too, with my pocket money, with my savings book at the post office,
Mm.
and of course, then going to spend it, get
Mm.
little what we call candy. No, we call sweeties, what you would call candy in the
Mm.
US. I,
Mm-hmm.
and then starting to buy records, and
Mm.
that I reckon, yeah, I remember the thrill of realizing that, yeah, you could trade this for stuff that you might
Yeah.
actually want.
Hey, it's Carl. Just want to pause here real quick. Did you hear the words Henry used? Exciting, thrilling. That moment when he realized that money could be traded for candy or records. That's the moment money first came alive. It's not just numbers, but energy, maybe even power. The power to choose, to participate, and maybe even to belong. We all have a version of that story, and often that's where our relationship with money begins. Not with spreadsheets, but with the feelings. What's your first moment of that energy? Maybe your first moment of thrill with money. And how might that early experience still be shaping the way you feel or think about money today? Yeah, it's so interesting, exciting and thrill and yeah. What was money like growing up in your home?
Um, well, there was, both my parents were employed at Oxford University, so there wasn't a palpable shortage of money. There was
Mm,
not. They weren't terribly wealthy, but I don't remember there being money worries.
mm,
Um, and Actually, overall, it just wasn't very much a topic of conversation as a
mm,
kid. When I was a kid,
mm,
it wasn't sort of a, you know I guess that points to there being neither a shortage of it nor a superabundance of it. It wasn't like we were living in a way that was radically different from all my friends. It seemed, some of them I noticed had bigger houses or sort of grander houses, but somehow I didn't really kind of think about that in terms of money. It was just like, yeah, they've got that big house up on the hill, and it's fun to race around in the woods there, or something, and
mm-hmm,
I don't remember being very kind of comparative about it,
hmm,
like, wow, their garden's 10 times the size of ours or something.
hmm,
It never really occurred to me. It was like,
hmm,
there's things we can do in that garden and there's things we
hmm.
can do in our garden, and they're both fun.
What do you make of that? Like it sounds so idyllic and quaint in the day we live in now in terms of comparative. Like the statement like there was no comparative nature to it or it
Yeah.
wasn't comparative sounds like so lovely, right? Doesn't it? Now? I mean,
Yes.
what do you
Yeah.
make of that now?
Well, actually, I had, I don't know, I may be a little bit unusual in this, but I had I started to love rambling through the English countryside when I was about 12 years old.
Mm,
And with just a sleeping bag and a backpack and a pack of sausages, and newspaper and matches so I could light a fire, doing it with friends.
yeah.
And I loved kind of living close to the land. And in the course of several summers when I was doing that, between the age of maybe 12 and 17 or something, I got to know this tramp, a real old
Mm.
school
I
tramp,
was going to ask you what's the character's name from the book? Is this who we're talking about?
Yeah, it is. He's called
Yeah,
Speedy.
that's right.
Yeah, he said they call me Speedy on account of I'm so slow. It's, and he would walk around England. That's how he lived, and he came to
Yeah.
our valley um, every summer. And this was a man who did not have a home, who had a couple of dogs who he loved and were very useful to him, and who knew how to live basically without money. And I admired his way of life more than the ways of life of anybody else I'd ever met, because he had this exceptional freedom that I hadn't known was a human possibility, whereby he didn't he was at home everywhere. He didn't need a building to be at home. It sort of blew my mind that you could actually live that way. And it was around that time as well that I was really getting into poetry, and I was reading the Beats, Jack Kerouac and the Dharma Bums. I was reading these Chinese poets who also wondered. That was their thing, to wander the countryside, the rivers
Wow.
and gorges and mountains, and write poems. And I thought, what a way to live. You're actually really being a human being if you do that. You're sort of facing the immediacy of being this body on this earth. And I just felt that's what I want. I haven't fully managed to create that, but some aspects of it I have much of my life. And
Huh.
and I haven't stopped feeling that it's really more important to recognize what we are as a creature, a human beings walking this earth. That sort of feels more important to me. I don't want 3 luxury homes. I just don't want it. I've never actually wanted that. I don't care. I want to have enough space and warmth, and I kind of like eating very healthily, and I enjoy food. But I just have never had great aspirations to, you know, deep, highly prestigious luxuries. I'm
Hmm.
not built that way.
What I really want to try and put some framework around that feeling, because I don't know exactly what it is, and I think freedom might be their word, but like the idea of Speedy, because I've wondered the same thing, and reading that story in your book, One Blade of Grass, I was just struck by and I'm trying to even like for listeners who aren't watching, like I often find myself rubbing my fingers together, like trying to grasp, what is that feeling? And would that be the word you would use, is just the kind of exhilaration of freedom, like
Yeah,
truly free?
yeah, it's some beautiful combination of freedom and home.
Mm,
That
mm,
this guy could be at home
mm.
kind of anywhere. That his home was fields, hedgerows, trees, meadows, broken down old barns. There was an old mill, a ruined mill, where he
Yeah,
used to stay when he was in our
yeah.
valley, a mile from our house. And I think I'll tell you what, there's a line of Wordsworth, the
Mm,
great English poet. He had something similar. There's a line of his. I'll just recite it. The earth was all before me, and with a heart joyous, nor scared at its own liberty, I look about, and should my chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. So he's actually been at university and had a fairly unhappy time. And he's come back to the hills of northern England, which he grew up in, and he's home again in those hills. But that doesn't mean a little cottage, it means wandering the whole land. So the earth was all before me, and with a heart joyous nor scared at its own liberty, I look about. And should
mm,
my chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. That sense of both home and freedom and
mm,
adventure all in one.
mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. I was just thinking back. We spent 4 years in New Zealand and then a year in London, and we ended up, just through a series of fateful events, being in Painswick
I know it. I used
in
to live near that.
in the Cotswolds
Yeah.
for 6 weeks of lockdown,
Wow.
and we lived in a house down at the bottom of the hill that was an old mill. So we lived in like the servants' quarters, the old servants' quarters. It was an old barn, but it was now beautiful, and there was a horse and fields everywhere. But the idea, I'm just explaining this for listeners who may not have spent time in that area. Like the idea of wandering through the fields, there's gates. It's a little different than in America, where there's private property still a thing, but the ability to access or walk across, it's much different in New Zealand, much different in the UK. And so I got this sense of like walking in kind of, up to the old Roman ruins there nearby. Like there was this sense of ancient, I don't know, a deep energetic feeling, and the idea of Speedy wandering through, and that could be home and enough, all those words. How do you think, I mean, we'll get deeper into it, but how do you think we got so far away from that plot? Like,
Mm.
you know, no desire for 3 luxury homes, you said. And the idea of just feeling a deep sense of safety and home and enoughness in the presence of almost nothing. Like, how did we get so far away from that, or so
Yeah.
lost or distracted?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, I think it's nothing new. If we look at
Mm,
all the ancient spiritual traditions, one way or another, they address that acquisitive side of us where we can get caught in wanting stuff. It is a human capacity to get really embroiled in a path of getting more and more and more. Um, so I think I would say, like, Buddhism talks about the three poisons, and one of them is greed. And I mean, it's not really. It may sound a little disparaging, but it's really trying to say, hey, um, be mindful of that, because it can mislead you if you think it's a path to happiness. It's actually not likely a path to happiness. It may be a path you want to follow. That's fine. But just don't think it's going to bring you the happiness that is really most deep, that you perhaps most deeply want. So I always think, like, there's nothing wrong with. I know I don't want to take us off track, actually, but it's, if people want to get great wealth, good on them. That's fine. But it's not. That's not the path to happiness. That's a thing you can do if you want, and up to a point, it's definitely, whatever that research is, up to $80,000 annual revenue. So that sounds a little low to me, but whatever the number is, you know, it's not a hugely extravagant number that will make a large difference in your well-being. And it's beyond that it may not make the returns diminish quite rapidly beyond that level. But I think that I really, like I said, I don't feel any sort of judgment towards people who want to pursue great wealth if that's their thing. It's just that it won't give happiness.
mm,
I don't
mm,
believe it'll give happiness.
mm,
You can do other things while pursuing great wealth that will bring happiness, and a lot of that is sort of working on yourself, so that all the things we know about it. It's not, can I have what I want? It's, can I want what I have?
mm,
Like, can I recognize how much is already being given? I mean, I found myself on a spiritual path much of my life. It was just in me that I needed to pursue a kind of spiritual development. Who knows why, but I did, and it was really, really helpful. And in one of the traditions I've trained most deeply, Zen, they say that the aim is to become a person who needs nothing.
mm.
And that's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, a person who needs nothing needs to be written down. We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires. Yeah, it's interesting to me that for as long as we have records, as you pointed to, we've given money a job it can't do. I often think, like, in fact, sometimes in the retreats that we lead, we do an exercise where we have $100 bill, a fresh, crisp one, and you journal as if you were the $100 bill talking to you. And then you do the opposite. And one of the things I always feel like the $100 bill would say to me is like, bro, come on, man, you've given me a job. There's no chance. It feels to me like the $100 bill would feel like some shame and a little bit of guilt and a little bit of disappointment that it had not done the job that I'd given it. And it would just want to say, I'm just a piece of paper, right? Or even zeros and ones. I can't provide happiness, love, freedom enough. I can't really, I just think it's so interesting that from the beginning of time, we've given it a job it can't do.
Yes. Now, look, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways we could go, but I'm just thinking of there's a sutra in early Buddhism where the Buddha is talking about well-being, and he says there's two kinds. There's well-being that is worldly. There's worldly well-being. And he gives the example of a farmer. He says, don't overspend. Make sure that your revenue is greater than your expenses, and keep your
Wait,
laborers.
use those actual words. Don't
Yeah, I mean,
overspend.
yeah, he said, I forget exactly how it's put, but it's like, don't let you want to have a surplus, don't let it diminish so that you have too little, and so that you can't buy what you need. And treat your family well, treat your workers well. And he sort of gives sage and sound advice for well-being on a kind of material level. And then he says, but there's also, well, the term is non-worldly well-being. And that's the kind that you find through the deep practice, through the meditative path, through the spiritual life, where you can come to find intrinsic well-being that's not so dependent on outside conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just so fat. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I just feel that it's not. I would say that I mean, for sure, people can be suffering a lot because of a lack of funds and resources. They don't want to diminish that at all. It can be a real intense hardship. Not only can it be, it is for probably billions of people right now. They're worrying about the next meal. I used to teach poetry at a high school here, and there were kids sleeping in a car, and could they be given lunch that day at school was their biggest worry. It's really terrible, the inequities that we live under, where it's grotesque. When there's many people with just insane amounts of money, and many people with not enough for their basic needs. And that's something that the wealthy could generate so much happiness for themselves if they knew how much suffering there really is and could deploy their wealth in strategic ways. And of course many do, but probably many more could do more, to really alleviate huge amounts of suffering very swiftly. And that is great wealth. I think, in my understanding, is wealth isn't really a figure on a piece of paper. It's how you feel. And the capacity to abundantly give is, I think, a big part of real, true wealth. I mean, I'm not an expert in the field at all, but I have read Lynn Twist. She's got that great book, The Soul of Money. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you personally manage that tension between the amount you deploy or give or use to help others and the amount that you keep? We had Peter Singer on not too long ago, and we were talking about this. I mean, there's always somebody worse off, right? There's always, and in a world where you're aware of the fact that for a couple dollars you could save a life, and then where do you take, I mean, some people call it, like, if you take that to the illogical conclusion, they call that the repugnant conclusion, right? That, and what Peter said was, well, one thing's clear, you shouldn't give to the point where you're worse off than the person you're giving to. And I thought that was like he said, because the goal is net, we're trying to lower suffering. And if you enter into the suffering together, you've not lowered it. So I thought that
Yeah.
was really useful, but I'm curious how do you think about your own abundance and privilege versus what you could be doing? How do you manage that tension?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, much of my adult life, when I was, my livelihood was teaching Zen. I wasn't making a lot of money. I wasn't making a lot of money. I was very lucky to, have a very generous board at the center I was teaching at, and they took care of us. But it wasn't, and sometimes I've had some very generous book deals at times, and I've had other kinds of work as well over the years. But by and large, I wasn't making a massive income for stretches of my adult life. When I have made more money, I just, it's really important to me to be making donations, and I do it where my heart is most engaged in causes that I really care about, and I'll kind of give as much as I think I can without hurting our household,
Mm,
you know.
mm. Isn't it just like how badly we want a rule of thumb? But yeah, that's sort of where it comes down to, like, without, I give as much as I can, I give as much as reasonable, like these phrases that only we can sort of feel our way into.
Yes, I think that's right, and I did find Lynn Twist really helpful on that.
Mm,
Like
yeah, I agree.
really, yeah, opening up the door to feeling like um, actually often I have an idea and then I realize I could give more. I
Mm,
could give more.
mm,
And I nearly always make myself follow that impulse if I feel I could give more. There's a couple of times in my life when I really regretted not giving. It wasn't a large amount of money, but there was one particular time when somebody reached out to me and I didn't really know them very well. And it was at a time when I wasn't, I was a graduate student. And so I was thinking in terms of week to week on my money. But after, and I didn't step up. And I mean, this is a kind of confession, that I'm offering.
sure.
And I guess I was 28 or something like that. I can't remember exactly, maybe a little younger than that. And I had no way of getting back in touch with him. He'd found my number, he'd called me from somewhere, and I couldn't call him back. And I just didn't jump on it. And I could have done. It wasn't easy because I had no spare money really, but I could have done it, and I didn't. And I remember that as a moment when I really wished, in retrospect, that I had, and I don't want to feel that regret again.
Mm. Hey, it's Carl. Just a brief pause here. What Henry just described is something many of us know: the sting of a moment past, the difference that we could have made, the help that we could have offered, but didn't. But what I loved about what Henry talked about here is, while the pain of that moment is still present, what I loved about what Henry talked about is that he's not using that moment to beat himself up. He's using it to drive change in the way he makes decisions going forward. This idea of trying to minimize regret reminds me of a popular decision-making framework called regret minimization. It's pretty simple. When you're facing a choice, especially around money, simply ask yourself, will I regret not doing this? Make the decision through the lens of minimizing your regret. That can be incredibly helpful. And if the answer is yes, I'll regret not doing this with money, well, you've got your answer. It just play that story through for me. Like, how has that impacted? I'm just curious about how quickly that story came up, and I notice this a lot with often people will say about earliest memory of money or childhood or in their home, and they'll tell this really poignant story, and then they'll say something like, I haven't thought of that for 25 years. And I'm really curious about, you and I both know that the roles of those experiences, whether we're thinking about them or not, are playing out in our lives. How do you think that experience of wishing you could have helped has played out in your life, affected other choices you've made around money? Are you aware of that at all?
Yeah, I'm definitely aware that I think it became a kind of spur to my practice that I wanted to find a fundamental reorientation where I was less concerned with myself
Hmm.
and more spontaneously inclined to take on concerns for others. And I wanted that to be not just an impulse of generosity and a capacity to recognize when I had the converse impulse, to actually be kind of stingy. There's a precept in Zen: don't be stingy.
Really, just that
it's
direct?
it's that direct.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's I think there's a translation which is a little bit more elaborate, which says don't begrudge the Dharma treasure or something like that. But
Mm.
it means don't be stingy. And of course the flip side of that is simple: be generous. But I had to admit I had a stingy bone in my body. I did, and I didn't want it to win. And so yeah, partly that led to more consciousness of the importance of being generous.
Mm.
It's actually, again, in Buddhism, there's one set of sort of guidelines for Buddhist practice, and the first is 6 things called the paramitas. We don't need to go into it, but the first one is generosity. They say the whole of practice begins with generosity, and I sort of liked that and took it on board and tried to live by it as I got deeper into practice, but I didn't really understand it until much later when I had a really an experience that really sort of shook my life up, which is in that book, One Blade of Grass, late towards the end of it. When I realized that everything is already generosity. The fact that anything exists, the fact that we're having any experience at all, let alone this particular life, it's all an infinite generosity. And if we want to live well, if I want to live well, I have to live in accordance with that. I have to be aligned with that infinite generosity. Otherwise, I'm kind of out of line.
How when you find how would you guide someone, or what advice would you give to someone when they find themselves out of line? So I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was yesterday Monday. Over the weekend, I found out that I had a rather large unexpected bill. It has to do with April 15th, if that helps. Yeah, and it was relatively stressful for me because we do a pretty good job of planning. So it was not only was it the amount, but it was just the surprise. And so I spent yesterday kind of wandering around out of line. And I'm going to add a little bit more to the story. Um, there was some event, I'm not actually all that clear about it, with my father and getting sideways with taxes. and it played a role, right? Like I don't really know the details of it. This event actually caused me to. So tax for me is always like I'm super careful about it because I there's some fear of
Yeah.
like I don't want to end up having that experience
Yeah.
woven into my, epigenetic trauma almost. But what practical use in that moment? Let's just say you get a surprise bill.
Hmm. Hmm.
What do you do?
Yeah, I have actually. I
I'm
have.
sure you have because you're human.
Not right now, but I have had one not long ago, and it was in the similar context. I was like, whoa, really? Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
Well,
So
I
what do you
mean,
do?
well, I had a bit of shock. I had a bit of dismay, and then I quickly asked myself, "Can we afford it?" And the answer was yes. And then I just take a moment and I remember that I'm not an isolated entity. I'm part of a fabric. I'm part of a great fabric that includes
Mm,
all this world,
mm,
And it
mm.
just the sense of being at home, the sense of not being threatened, not being unsafe comes back, And yeah, it's a drag, and it was
Right, right.
I had to move things around that I didn't want to move around,
Yeah.
but it was not actually, it wasn't going to really hurt us in a really threatening kind of way. It was a drag, and so I mean, I don't think that my feeling is that we're and some would disagree with me, but in terms of meditation, we don't want to be, I don't want to become a robot who has no feelings.
Mm,
It's
mm.
more like it's quicker and easier to dial things down, quicker and easier to remember that this life is a gift, and that I'm have the privilege and honor of being part of something way bigger than me.
Hey, Carl here. Let's keep this really simple. What do you do when you get knocked off center, as Henry called it? Really simple. You notice. That's it. You notice. That's the move. That's the practice. You realize, oh, I'm off. Maybe you feel a tightness in your chest or some sort of buzzing in your head or tightness in the shoulder blades at the base of your neck. You take a breath or two. That's it. That tiny moment of awareness, that pause, gives you the ground to make a shift. It brings you back to the present. It brings me back to the present, out of the concern about the tax bill. And from there, I gain a little sense of control, and that sense of control starts to grow. Of course, it doesn't change the circumstances necessarily, but it does change my ability to take the very next step. And in moments where you feel knocked off center, where things are uncertain, being able to take the very next step is all that really matters. Yeah, I didn't plan on asking you this, but it strikes me that we're recording this during a period of some real uncertainty. And I don't spend too much time paying attention, but I know when things are uncertain because lots of people start asking me questions.
Yeah.
And how, when you're faced with that level of real, or at least, sorry, it's not even real, it's projected future uncertainty that's going to have a huge impact on our lives, all a projection,
Yeah.
all a story. What is the process? Because I think it's really interesting. You pointed to the idea, like I felt the tension or whatever it was. Is it the idea of just noticing the tension, the fear, the anxiety? Is that where it starts? Instead of letting that anxiety drive you to make decisions, lash out at people, be upset, is that where it starts? Is just the noticing of the feeling?
I totally agree. I think it is. I think it
Hmm.
is exactly to notice. Ah, whoa, there's this sensation
How you
in
do
my
that?
body.
Like, so yeah, talk me through that. Like
Yeah.
you know, like where do you feel it?
Well, I know that, emotions are body sensations, basically. Of course, there can be a cognitive component, of course, there can be, but the actual heart and soul of an emotion is in the body. And to feel body sensation, like it's usually chest, solar plexus, belly, occasionally it's throat. That's the research. That's where people feel, let's say, the emotion of anxiety, for example.
Mm, mm,
94% of people, some research says, feel it in the chest. The other 6% is a little bit lower in the solar plexus. And that's mostly the range. It's inside the volume of the torso that we humans get the heart, the core of our emotion sensation. So if we're able to just be aware of that, what's great about feeling the body sensation is if you're feeling the body sensation, if you're really feeling it, the stories stop.
mm,
That's the best thing
mhm,
about it. And we
mhm,
used to have this little motto in our Zen Center, SOS, sensations over stories.
mm,
And it's a go to the sensation. And also, good thing about the sensation is that it's the body, and the body lives only in the present moment. Whereas, the mind is a time traveler, off to the past, off to the future. But the body is in the here and now. And when we're in the here and now, we got our
yeah, no
imaginations
problems.
under
Yeah.
control. Our imaginations are quietened. But I'll tell you, there's another side to it, though. It's that I know so many other people are suffering. That this time right now is a tremendous infliction upon so many helpless people or vulnerable people. It's like an assault on millions of vulnerable people. So many people with important jobs suddenly don't know if they got a job. I'm friends with a lawyer in DC. The carnage that her clients are going through
Mm.
is just breathtaking. So I have it good compared to that, and I feel. But I mean, what I'm saying really is that to recognize suffering in others makes a huge difference to our own suffering.
Hey, it's me again, one last time. Here's one of the most useful tools we've ever shared on the show. It's called what Henry referred to it as SOS, sensations over stories. When financial stress hits, a surprise tax bill, any of this sound familiar? A market drop, a moment of panic. We pause, drop into your body, chest, gut, maybe the throat, because once you feel the sensation, so get out of the story into the sensation, the story loses its power. The catastrophe, what if, gets a little quieter. And we return to the only place where we can make a good money decision, here and now, calmly. Do you have any, do you have any practical, that's really, I was just thinking about the overwhelm of that suffering, that you're just sort of bombarded with the news. And I've got a close friend that talks about how important for her, and this is just one idea, for her gardening is, because she goes out, and is it Tonglin? Is it
Yeah,
is the idea of like kind of like absorbing a little bit suffering wise, and then do I have that right?
you do, and
Yeah.
sharing whatever peace you've got
Yeah.
yourself.
So
Yeah,
almost like breathing in a little bit of like you become the fire that transforms. And she does that through her gardening.
no,
So she'll go out, and instead of getting too absorbed in the stories of the news, she'll feel all of that, and it'll
yeah,
be quite an emotional experience for her, but she'll work with the dirt and work with the plants and work with the soil and she said like that is the best thing I could do. It's
yeah,
not selfish,
yeah,
it's
no,
actually the opposite. How do you
yeah,
think about when you feel maybe a little overwhelmed? I'm thinking of like we call this scary markets, like when market economy world is scary. how do you have practical go-tos that you use? I mean, we notice it in the body, of course, but then what do you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the things I do is Tonglen practice. Yeah.
Mm,
Bringing on, I want to, whatever suffering is like mine out in the world, bring it on, bring it to me. And whatever peace I'm finding, I want to give it out, give it out, give it away, you give it away. So that's very helpful because it keeps it flowing. But part of what's good about that is it generates compassion.
mm.
Because the one piece of research, forgive me if I'm telling you stuff you already know, but
No, I love
the
it. Yeah.
difference between empathy and compassion,
Mm,
empathy is just feeling the suffering of others, well, feeling the feelings of others, but including suffering, of course. But compassion is the wish that others not suffer. And also that we not suffer, self-compassion. And compassion is a positive emotion and it's energizing. And whereas empathy can be kind of overwhelming, but compassion is different, and at the moment, I mean, I'm finding I'm having a lot of compassion for so many people being hurt by reckless policies of our new administration that are just incredibly damaging, and I feel a lot of compassion for the way people are suffering. There's also a kind of, in Buddhism, there's a kind of anger that's righteous.
mm.
You're not wishing ill will on anyone, but you're kind of feeling strongly on behalf of those who are being harmed. So you don't want to inflict harm on anyone at all. There's no ill will, but you do feel sort of righteous anger on behalf of those being unfairly afflicted. And that's quite a positive emotion, actually, if it doesn't get out of hand.
Right, right, right. Oh, that's so helpful. Let me shift gears just a little bit. In Zen, it seems like people love to play with paradoxes. And I'm curious if there is something paradoxical about or inherently contradictory between spiritual awakening and the pursuit of financial security. What would you say about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Um,
Mm,
Zen has this ideal that people go through a deep training. It takes them to, insights and discoveries and awakening experiences that shatter their ordinary view of things and awaken them to a whole other dimension. And then they keep practicing and they come right back down into the marketplace. There's a term, returning to the marketplace with gift bestowing hands. That's sort of the end of practice. So
is that let
meaning
me can I ask you real quick, is that the before enlightenment chop wood, carry water, after enlightenment chop wood, carry like that's it's
it,
pointing to
it
the same
it
thing?
it really is. It
Mm,
really is. That
mm,
the idea isn't to check out and hang out in some blissed out place on the top of the mountain. That may happen in the course of training, but that's not the end of training. It's one teacher I knew, not one of my teachers actually. He said, yeah, we turn earth to gold, but we got to turn gold back into earth, and
mm,
that's the longer process. So the
mm,
getting to the clarification that everything's one and everything's empty, and it's a shatteringly amazing thing to discover, but it's not the end of the path. It's not even halfway in Zen's view. Then the longer journey is to bring that realized perspective back into ordinary life. So, what does that ordinary life look like? That's a multiplicity of things, but for sure, it could be a businessman who needs to make
paying the
profit.
mortgage, yeah,
Yeah,
paying your
totally.
taxes.
Yeah. In fact, my own Zen master, that I've trained with a lot in Japan, is the CEO of a huge. He was high up in Mitsubishi Securities for many years. Now he runs an office furniture company that employs 3,000 people, and
Mm,
he's a busy businessman as well as a teacher for hundreds and
mm.
hundreds of Zen, many of them teachers, actually, Zen students and Zen teachers around the world. So people ask him, how do you balance your Zen with your work life? And he says, what do you mean? There's nothing to balance. There's no separation. It's all one thing.
Mm. would you say, I'm curious about this, your money or your life, or your money and your life?
Well, Zen would say anything you have, you never really had it.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I remember um, my actually this same Zen master saying once, showing his fancy watch he had at the beginning of retreat, saying, "So most people, we want to get the things we want. I've got this nice watch, I like it, and we want to have status, we want to have money, we want to have family, friends, things we love around us, and we know that one day we'll lose them all, and that's a basic human suffering. Is the fact that we're going to lose the things that we love."
Mm.
And he said, so Zen's solution to that problem, most people try to solve it by just hoarding and clinging on as long as they can and get as much of what they want. And he said, what the Zen solution is to have the insight that you never really had them to begin with.
Mm.
And that's a whole other territory we could go into. But it is actually a beautiful point that we predicate our possessing of things on this self in here that I'm
Mm.
sure I am, that will possess them.
Mm.
But
Mm.
the self is actually not as certain a thing as we take it to be. And that's one of the deep investigations we can do in a lifetime, is what really is the sense of self.
Mm. Speaking of investigations, I was curious. I looked and I couldn't necessarily find one. Uh, Zen often teaches through koans, and I know you're a koan master,
Well, I don't
whatever
know,
that means.
a koan fool,
Exactly. If you were creating a koan about money, like, what would it be, and how would you use it?
There is one, actually.
That's
There's
what I
a
was wondering.
there's a master who was asked, what is the heart of awakening? And he said his answer was, what is the price of rice in Lu Ling? What is the price of rice in Lu Ling? That was his answer. How much does rice cost in Lu Ling? That was his answer. Now, I know that's,
To the question of what is the heart of awakening?
yeah,
What is the price of rice?
yeah. In other words, what is the fundamental truth of our existence? How much is gas in Tennessee?
Are you gonna tell us more? Or is this one of those, like, you'll
Well,
have to find out?
yeah, it's one of those things where I could say a little bit,
Let's say,
but but
I
it
know
might
this
not.
game. I know this game about koans, so I'm trying to a little bit more.
I'll say this much. I don't know how much help this will be, but the whole point, really, of this what awakening is discovering the one fact of our existence, that we're not what we thought we are. We're kind of everything. There's
Mm,
nothing that we're not part of.
mm,
Therefore, even something that might seem as strange and abstract as the price of gas, actually, that's part of your very own being.
mm,
And
mm,
you might think, well, so what? But actually, to really experience that is to have the greatest bounty, the greatest abundance, the greatest wealth
mm,
we can possibly have. It's like
mm,
there's a moment in War and Peace when Pierre, the main character, is a prisoner of the French army, during the Napoleonic Wars.
mhm,
And he's been stripped of he's a very wealthy guy and he's been stripped of all his wealth. And he sees these French people trying to possess Russia, because they've invaded Russia at that time, 1812. And he suddenly has this epiphany that, and they've, and that, sorry, I got it slightly wrong. They've imprisoned him in some old barn along with a lot of other prisoners, and he has this epiphany that he is inseparable from all the fields, all the land, the trees, the clouds, the sky. He's inseparable from all of it. he can't possibly be imprisoned. It doesn't matter how small a cell they will put him in. He's already always been part of everything. So that's awakening. That's a true awakening, that we are, we're inseparable from all, and therefore boundlessly free, and also boundlessly wealthy.
So good. Thanks, Henry. Let me just ask you a couple of rapid fire questions as we wrap up. Because we could talk about this all day. If you had a specific amount of money allocated, given to you with the instructions to spend it on happiness, what would you spend it on?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd probably want to sort of do something for my close family members. Like if it was enough money, like build them a studio, each of them, where they could do the work they want to do, or something like that. Maybe there'd be a holiday. And then I'd want to give a lot. If it was enough, I'd set up a foundation so that I could keep giving maximally to people in the most intense suffering around the world. To help organizations that are helping them.
Yeah. When it comes to money, what are you most afraid of?
I think honestly, I would be a little bit afraid of getting too caught up in it myself.
That you just couldn't handle it, like flying too close to the sun.
Yeah. I think it's not that likely that I'm going to be risking that. You know?
Right. It's so funny. A lot of people always say, like, that's a problem. I'm okay. I'm okay trying that problem. Like, nobody quite believes that it's actually the problem that it is.
Well, exactly. Now, I know that if I really did get too caught up in it, I would have to practice hard to get clear again. But we've got this app going that I'm part of, and it's growing quite fast, and it is making revenue, and it's doing kind of well, and I have to just be a little bit conscious that, hey, this is I know my role here is as the best I can, a sharer of pathways to this great discovery about at the heart of who we and what we are. And man, I do not want to get that clouded over by getting caught up in that stuff.
How do you handle that with because you're also part of the book market, like you write a book, now you've got to go wave your hands about the book. Do you have any tools for not getting caught up in your own press or the ego candy or any of that stuff that's often demanded, or at least lots of people engage in?
Well, I mean, I sincerely feel that the book was a gift to me, and I've passed it on as a gift to whoever it will speak to. So I don't feel I could notice it if I notice that I'm getting kind of concerned or caught up in how's it doing, and why did that guy win a prize and I didn't, or something.
Right.
If I notice that happening, which mercifully I haven't, but if I did, that would be a sign that hey, I've forgotten that it's a gift. It's a gift in every direction. It's an offering. It's just an offering. Yeah.
Love that. Well, let's wrap up with this question. We sort of already talked about this, but I'd love maybe you could just walk us through again specifically. Imagine someone listening right now feels a bit trapped by money. Maybe it's in debt, maybe it's the scary market situation we talked about. If you could offer one Zen-inspired practice or idea to help them sort of shift their relationship with money and find greater peace, what would it be as we wrap up?
Yeah. Give yourself a moment of stillness and quiet, and trust that right in the heart of you, there is a peace beyond all understanding. There's a peace that is not based on causes and conditions. And it's actually right in the heart of who you are, an unconditional peace. And it's not going to solve all your problems, but being able to tap into that will give you a very different perspective from which to address your issues.
Henry, thanks so much for this conversation. It was everything I'd hoped it would be.
Carl, I'm really, really honored to be able to chat with you like this.
That wraps up another conversation on 50 Fires, a podcast about money and meaning. If this conversation with Henry helped you feel something, maybe a little calmer, maybe a little clearer, a little more at home in your own life, well, consider sharing it with somebody who might enjoy it. And if you're curious about more of Henry's work, make sure to check out his new app, The Way, or pick up his memoir, which is fantastic, One Blade of Grass. Until next time, may life actually be a place where you experience meaning, purpose, generosity, and maybe, if we're lucky, peace. Cheers, my friends. Until next episode.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Binel Audio, nor Magnolia.